There's a kind of warmth that doesn't come from sunlight or fire, but from the eyes that linger a little longer. The silence that feels like a song, and the closeness that speaks even when no words are said. If you are new here, welcome. Please do like and subscribe the channel. It helps me a lot. Now let's get back to the story. I used to think that kind of warmth was reserved for fairy tales or stolen moments in old novels. But lately, I felt it real and unshakable, in the presence of someone I never expected. His eyes don't just see me. They study the woman I am beneath the layers I wear for the world, and when he speaks, it's the spaces between his words wrap around me like the gentlest embrace. It shouldn't have happened. Not with him, of all people yet here. I am heart-racing in quiet rooms and breath-catching in shared glances, not because it's forbidden, but because it's undeniable. It began subtly like rain tapping against a window you weren't expecting to open, and moved into his home with my husband after our wedding. The house was old, but dignified. Much like him, my father-in-law, he had this composed way of moving through the day. Like every step was, deliberate every thought, carefully weighed. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, you listened, not out of fear, but out of respect, or something deeper in the beginning. It was nothing more than stolen glances. Or so I thought, a gentle smile. When our eyes met over breakfast, a quiet observation. He'd make that, only I would understand. But things changed. The day I found myself alone in the kitchen struggling with a jammed window, he came to help, his hands brushing over mine, calm, and certain that touch lingered longer than it needed to, and yet it didn't feel wrong, felt remembered if something had lived, in that moment before we had after. That the air around us shifted. It wasn't loud or sudden, it was quiet, like how twilight slips into night. I became aware of his presence more keenly. I'd catch the soft sound of his steps when he walked past my door. I'd feel his gaze when I laughed, too freely at the dinner table, and when we were alone, even just briefly. The silence carried something it never used, to something warm and heavy and magnetic. There was a night when the rain fell hard and the power flickered. Out, my husband was away for work, and the house felt both enormous and too still. I'd light a few candles in the living room, wrapped myself in a throw and curled up with a book, trying to ignore how the shadows danced along the walls. He came in quietly, carrying a lantern, and asking if I was all right. In a noted offering a soft smile, he sat down across from me, close but not too close. Yet it felt close enough to make my chest ache. We talked that night more than we ever had, about memories, about loss, about how strange it is to feel alone, even when you're surrounded by people. He told me about his late wife, my husband's mother, and how grief sometimes slips into the smallest parts of your day without asking. His voice was soft, almost distant. He was speaking from a place he hadn't opened in a long time. I didn't speak much, I just listened, watching how his eyes held stories that his lips hadn't touched in years. And then he looked at me. Really looked at me, not as his son's wife, not as a guest in his home, but as a woman, one who saw him, who heard the things he didn't say. That moment, though, fleeting, stayed with me for days. I found myself thinking about it while doing the most mundane things, folding laundry, watering the plants, setting the table. His face, his voice. That look, the days after that, grew quieter but not empty. We spoke less, but when we did, the words carried a weight that pulled at something inside me. I'd feel his presence before he entered a room. I'd sense when he was standing behind me before I turned around. And sometimes when our fingers brushed as we passed things to one another, I'd feel a softness so deep it nearly stopped my breath. There was a Sunday afternoon when we were in the garden together pruning the roses. My husband was upstairs on a call, his laughter drifting down through the window. But I wasn't listening to that, but I was watching the way the sunlight hit his father's face. The lines of time, the strength in his hands, the gentleness he carried despite everything he'd endured. I asked him something, I don't even remember what now, and he turned to answer, but his gaze fell on my lips before he spoke. It was a second, maybe less, but it told me everything, and I didn't look away. I think that was when it knew whatever. This was between us. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't a mistake. It was real, unspoken, yet louder than anything else in my life. We never crossed any lines. Not really. But the space between us became a living thing. It hummed with everything we weren't saying, and sometimes when the house was quiet and the night stretched, long I'd lay awake wondering what it would feel like if he ever let that silence break one evening. As I was heading to the kitchen, I passed his study. The door was half open, paused just for a second. Inside, he sat in his chair, holding a photo in his hands, his late wife. The way he looked at it, my heart, twisted, stepped in, quietly asked if he wanted tea. He looked up, startled. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from holding back something. Deeper, he smiled, faintly shook his head and murmured, "You remind me of her sometimes." That single sentence sat with me like a secret. It wasn't just about resemblance. It was about feeling familiarity, maybe even longing from then on. Something began to change in me too. Began to care about how I looked around him, not in an obvious way, but in the smallest details. The way I pinned up my hair, the scent I wore, the softness of my voice when I greeted him. And I noticed the same in him. He began to wear cologne again. He started leaving the study door, open more often when he knew I was nearby. There were nights when my husband worked late and I'd sit outside on the patio and he'd come join me. We'd sit in silence for long stretches, sipping tea, listening to the wind stir the leaves, and in those silences I felt more seen than in any conversation I'd ever had. Sometimes he'd tell me stories about when he was younger, the risks he took, the dreams he gave up, and I'd watch the way the moonlight softened his features, show the sadness and strength in him, coexisted like old friends. One such night as I stood up to go inside and stumbled slightly, the edge of the stone step catching my heel. He was beside me in an instant, his hand steadying my arm. Eyes met, and in that long, quiet look, every breath felt suspended. Neither office moved, neither of us spoke, but something passed between us. Something raw and real and beautifully terrifying. Then he stepped back and I walked away, but I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed that moment over and over. The closeness, the stillness, the weight of everything unspoken. Now every shared glance feels heavier, every word more layered, and though nothing has been said, allowed the truth of what we feel dance just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, wondering what will happen. If either of us dares to reach across that invisible line, and somewhere deep in my heart, I know that the story has only just begun. There's a moment just before the heart surrenders, when everything feels suspended, a breath before a storm, a glance before a touch, a silence so heavy it whispers every word. You've never dared to speak. We had lived in that moment for days. We tiptoeing on the edge of something beautiful and dangerous, never naming it yet, carrying it like a shared secret between our hearts. The morning after that night, on the patio, I found myself avoiding mirrors. Not because I was ashamed, but because my reflection knew it saw the longing in my eyes, the soft ache in my chest, the weight of something unfulfilled. I carried it with me through each hour, every interaction, pretending life was untouched. When inside something had shifted beyond turn, he was quieter than usual. Or maybe I was just more aware. At breakfast, he offered me the seat beside him, instead of across the table. My husband didn't notice. Why would he to anyone else? We were just family, but to us the nearness meant something. Our hands almost brushed our shoulders. Aligned, the air between us had changed. Again later that week, my husband left on a work trip 3 days away. I didn't think much of it at first, but when he kissed my forehead and said, "Take care of Dad while I'm gone," the something inside me stirred, something that tasted like fate and felt like fire. That evening, the house was quieter than I'd ever known it. Every sound echoed a little louder. A ticking clock, the soft rustle of curtains, my own breath I found him in. The study surrounded by shelves of books and memories, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up when I entered, just a glance, but it lingered. I asked if he'd eaten, he hadn't. So offered to make dinner. We didn't talk much while we ate. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound between us, yet every second was laced with tension, not the kind that asked for escape, but the kind that begged for understanding. After dinner, I brought 2 cups of tea to the living room. He joined me. We sat again like we had many times before on opposite sides of the couch, but this time it felt different. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You're not like anyone I've ever known," he said softly. His voice was low, raw at the edges, but gentle. I felt it more than I heard. I looked down, unsure what to say. My hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm I tried to carry. "I shouldn't say that," he added almost to himself. "But I've thought it too long to keep pretending I haven't." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. The kind that held meaning in its stillness. I didn't respond right. Away it couldn't. My heart was too loud in my chest, I know, whispered. Finally, I felt it too. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes they held. Everything, the pain of years past the depth of what we were now tangled in, and something else. "Hope I think I've been falling for you," he said, his voice barely audible. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle inside me. They didn't scare. They didn't feel wrong. They felt like truth. The kind you carry quietly, afraid the world might not understand. "I don't know how it happened," I murmured, "but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, not for a second." He reached for my hand, slow and unsure. When our finger touched something inside, me broke open. The warmth of his skin was steadying, familiar. My breath caught, not from surprise, but from relief, as if the moment we'd been circling had finally arrived. Still, we said nothing more. Words had done enough. Our hands stayed linked as the minutes passed, the night deepening around us, like a protective veil. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, the quiet held us close. That night, I didn't return to our bedroom immediately. I lingered in the living room long after. He went upstairs. The walls of the house felt different, like they too had heard our hearts speak. In the days that followed, we didn't speak of it again, but our connection was undeniable. There was no guilt, only reverence. Every interaction was soaked in understanding. A shared look in the hallway. Pause when passing each other. He'd brush my shoulder lightly. And it felt like a promise when my husband returned. Things resumed on the surface. But something inside me had changed, moved differently. Spoke softer, laughed less. Not because I was sad, but because I was carrying something too sacred to be careless with. We never spoke of love and loud words, but it existed in every gesture. In the way here. Remembered how I took my tea in the way. He'd leave a book on the table. He thought I'd like, in the quiet smile he'd give me when no one else was watching, and I loved him in return. Not in a reckless, wild way, but in the kind of way that writes itself into your bones. The kind of love that doesn't ask for forever, but promises, always, even now. I sometimes find myself staring at the garden, remembering the way he once looked at me there, sunlight catching his share, his eyes searching, mine for a truth we never dared name. We may never have crossed that final line. Maybe we never needed to, because in some strange, beautiful way, we belong to each other. Englands and silences in the spaces where love lives without needing to be spoken. Sometimes that kind of love is the most unforgettable.